Well, hello and good evening, everyone. This is Griffin Hall, wishing everyone a happy November. Hope you're all doing well, and I've got something a little bit different for you tonight. I don't normally do this kind of thing. I normally just put the pipes up and play some music, but I've always been a fan of writing some short stories, and I've got one for you that I've written earlier this year, tonight. I'm going to try and read it, and I hope you all enjoy. I am a resident of southern Oklahoma, and I live far out into the countryside where farmland is most all there is around. I have lived here from the time I was 10, when my parents moved from the big city life of New York out to the Great Plains for a drastic change of scenery. Since their move, they have been happier and generally more agreeable in all aspects of life. Sometimes the hustle of the city isn't for everyone. For those who don't know, Oklahoma is a very hot and dry place for most of the year. It can get brutally cold in the winter, and the rains are few and far between. On the rare occasion that a storm does roll in, they are quite something to behold. The landscape being mostly flat and far-reaching lends to being able to see massive storms slithering in across the sky. Claps of thunder rumble the pebbles on the gravel road, and bolts of lightning that are like fireworks on a blank canvas. Ever since I can remember, this has been my favorite kind of weather, until one day that I will never forget. My younger brother Sam and I were taking a weekend hike in southeastern Oklahoma, where the region is more forested. We're both big fans of the outdoors and taking advantage of the beauty that nature has to offer. The Americas have such a vast amount of differing ecosystems within them, and we enjoy exploring them all at our leisure. At the time, I was 29, and my brother was 21 years of age, and while the age gap between us was large, we still managed to get along just fine. We were not without our arguments on our previous trips, but these tend to level out as we both aged. The outdoors have always bonded our family, and we all seem to relax a bit more once we actually get out onto the trails. It's almost like taking a solo trip, but just having another body with you in case something goes wrong. This area of southeast Oklahoma is more heavily forested and full of hilly areas that eventually become the Ouachita Mountains. This region gets much more rain and is packed with lush foliage, and also has more elaborate wildlife than we're used to out in the plains. Pine and oak trees are most popular in this area, and when they grow undisturbed, they get huge and are magnificent in all of their glory. All of this being a welcome change from the flat prairie, we felt like being in a different world while we drove out east into the woods. After a late start from our B&B, Sam and I were making our way up the rear end of one of the vistas where we had planned to camp overnight. We had imagined a stunning view would be waiting for us at the top. However, we were beginning to lose daylight, and we could feel the winds beginning to change. The breeze was always a welcome relief, but it grew stronger and stronger as we neared the tip of the hill. As the wind blew, I could begin to smell the air changing to that recognizable scent and texture you feel before a storm is about to happen. This, paired with the clouds that became darker and more threatening, was a sure sign that we were running out of time. "It looks like rain," I said to Sam, who was walking ahead of me. "You've got to be kidding me," he turned and said with a sigh. I shrugged my shoulders at him in an effort to sympathize with his frustration. "We're almost to the top of this ridge, and we still have to set up our tent before it pours." He spoke again, resting his back against one of the oak trees. "I know," I spoke again. "The weather looked completely clear for today. Maybe this will pass us by, but we should at least pick up our pace if we want to get a good view." Our hiking relationship has always worked quite well. Sam has always been in charge of navigation and timekeeping, and I was more the practical type who always did my research on the region for what kinds of things were edible, what the conditions were like, and generally reading the signs that nature was giving me in the moment. After my encouragement, Sam nodded and we pressed on to climb the ridge. With every passing moment, the clouds became darker and the air became heavier. We knew we didn't have much time before we got soaked, so I started taking even bigger strides and walking with my weight held forward in an effort to quicken our pace. We would have normally taken a break by this point, but we wasted no time in trying to reach the top while our backpacks grew heavier with each step we took. Finally, after what seemed like days of speed walking, we began to see more sky opening up on the horizon as we came up upon the vista. The view was literally breathtaking as we both gasped for air that the atmosphere tried to squeeze from us. The clouds were enormous and full of water, which threatened to drop on us at any moment. We were able to see the tops of other hills and the lowest points in the valleys, just like something from a storybook. Filled with exhilaration and excitement, I neared closer to the edge to try and look further down the mountainside. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind blew me over, and I fell to the ground in an effort to stay away from the edge of the cliff, quickly making me feel powerless and scared. My brother laughed at me as my face gave a look of shock while I sat on the ground. As if it were a climax to our hard trek, a thick bolt of lightning shot out from the clouds, followed by a roll of thunder that rattled in our chests. We both looked at each other, knowing what had to come next. Without a word, we went to work on setting up our tent and pulling out our equipment from our backpacks. The wind was whipping through the trees now, and we could hear the birds make their last songs as the storm rolled in. With the tent taking shape and pulling out various parts from my backpack, I gave another look outward from the cliffside, out to the skies that were presenting a gorgeous picture of nature's power embodied by the storm. The sun was beginning to set, and the storm dragged across the sky, and turning the world into a beautiful stone gray mixed with deep red and burgundy tones, like chalk on a brick wall. Out from the clouds, my eyes focused on a shape that emerged on the wind of the storm. Illuminated by the intermittent flashes of lightning, the shape of a flying bird became clear as it rode the waves of the sky. If you've ever seen a large bird in flight, you know how they can give the illusion of not moving while they beat their wings and stay afloat in the sky. Their mass makes them seem motionless, and while they can move a great distance, they appear to be stationary in midair. This was not the case for this bird. I watched the jet black bird weave its way through the sky, turning and diving in and out of the huge cloud formations, disappearing from view for a moment, and then coming back into my line of sight. It seemed to glide across the sky with the speed of a tornado and the grace of an angel, beating its wings and falling through the covers of the storm. Demonstrating its prowess with ease, it managed all kinds of epic maneuvers as if it were performing for me. My eyes darted back and forth across the stage as it danced before me, captivating its audience and holding strong against the whipping winds. Admiring the bird and its freeness in the sky, I watched with awe as it made its last rounds about the kingdom of the sky and disappeared behind a thick cloud with a thematic bolt of lightning. Speechless with what I had just witnessed, I found myself very humbled at the greatness and majestic grace this creature had effortlessly shown me. I had never seen a bird move like that on any previous hike or even the wildest nature documentaries. The movements of the avian artist, having no obvious purpose in my mind, confused me as to what I thought exactly it was doing or where it was going. My thoughts instantly went to watching some of the best boxers or wrestlers and their movements about how they go about their surroundings in an effort to recharge their energy for their performance. Having no frame of reference other than clouds, I had no idea as to the size of the bird, and with how fast it was moving, I figured it must not be very big. "Hey, are you going to help finish or what?" Sam said, drawing me out of my trance. I had stopped setting up and being totally transfixed by the bird, had paused in mid-zipper opening of the tent's front entrance. We finished the last steps and staked the tent into the ground as the wind was blowing quite fiercely now. The thunder calmly rumbled as it neared our camp, where we were sitting outside the door watching the last flecks of light sink below the horizon. No stars could be seen as the veil of the storm covered the night sky, the occasional lightning strike giving us our view of the surroundings as darkness set in. I watched with bated breath, hoping for the return of the blackbird to give me another performance. But it never circled back a second time. Not long after dark, the raindrops could be heard on the roof of our tent as Sam and I munched on granola bars, the heavy atmosphere lifting and the air getting easier to stomach with each breath. We soon relaxed while the storm gave way to our security of the night. There is something naturally human about the rain putting us to sleep. Either the white noise or the rumbling of thunder, the sleep that you get camping in a rainstorm is the best sleep you can get anywhere. The light from our battery-powered lamps and lightning strikes overhead allowed us to see with limited range within the tent. Mutually quieting down, we listened to the symphony of dripping rain while we wrapped up in our sleeping bags and headed off to a sound sleep. Just as rain naturally puts humans to sleep, There is a primal feeling buried deep within our psyche that emerges when we're being watched. At some point during the night, raindrops still pattering above, I felt this feeling crawl up from my stomach. My eyes opened wide from a dead sleep, and I quickly took note of my surroundings. The tent lamps had powered off, and Sam was sound asleep a few feet away from me. The lightning struck all around us furiously, but was met with no thunder crashes to match them. This tense feeling littered the air as you could hear the sizzle of the electricity slice through the night. The shadows of the trees surrounding us were like sleeping giants, moving and bending in the wake of the wind like they were taking deep breaths. It felt like the majestic scenery from earlier had turned into something more sinister with the arrival of the storm. I'm not afraid of the dark, and I never have been. I'm afraid of getting caught unaware and being the last to know about something dangerous. In an effort to prove this to myself, I sat up in the tent and took the sleeping bag off of my body. Trying to find the source of this familiar feeling, I moved closer to the opening of the tent that was zipped up tight. We had positioned the tent with the opening facing the edge of the cliff in an effort to be met with that stunning view upon waking in the morning. As I unzipped the tent's door, I was met with an equally bewildering sight. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, the raindrops cascading down the door of the tent as I peeked out into the stormy night. The fierce wind blew the falling rain into my eyes, obscuring my view for passing seconds as the lightning scattered across the sky. The sky was black apart from the cloudy forms that were illuminated by the lightning bolts, creating a mountainous range above us. Only in the fleeting light of the storm could I make out an enormous shape darting across the sky. At first, I thought this was a weather balloon or someone's tent blowing around in the sky, but as I watched on while the storm illuminated the shape, it became clear that this was no inanimate object adrift in the sky. My heart became a pit in my stomach as I soon made out the object. Like a cloaked assassin, its moves were planned, predatory, and primal. The sound of sizzling lightning and the beating of massive wings was heard as the wind blew the creature around the storm. I began to make out its shape and noticed it moving closer and closer to the ridge we had camped on. Its features were all too familiar, with feathers as dark as the night, even though they shimmered in the rain as the lightning beamed down to earth. Massive, curled talons were tucked underneath its torpedo-like body, though not enough to obscure them from view. Its head like that of a sickly crow, and its hooked beak like that of a vulture. It moved with calculated efforts, harnessing the power of the storm, and riding the wind like a surfer on a tidal wave. Making one final swoop into the sky, the creature released a screeching bellow, triggering a massive thunderclap and echoing through the night. Caught in a horrible state of paralysis, I was shaken to the very fibers that tethered me to reality. Behind me, Sam awoke with a gasp out of a sound sleep by the thunder and sat straight up in the tent. He scrambled over to the opening of the tent and soon was gazing at the avian giant. Not a word was shared between us as we looked out into the night. The Thunderbird was even closer now, circling our tent like a falcon stalks a mouse. From a great height, it began a dive down the ridge while it tucked its wings close to its body. Time began to slow as it made its descent. With one final raise of its head, the Thunderbird's body became horizontal in midair, with talons exposed like powerful meat hooks. Its wings outstretched like a crucifix, and head aimed straight at our tent. The lightning began to swarm around its wings, striking furiously around the bird, first like a strobe light, then lighting the sky so brightly that the black bird became the only dark object for miles. Not one single clap of thunder was heard, but the energy of the storm and the lightning created a truly electric atmosphere. We felt it in our chests as the power surged through all the living beings nearby and through the earth into our bodies like vibrations in a spider's web. In a flash, the bird had beat its wings, dispersing the bolts, and was headed our way faster than a Polaris missile, talons at the ready like an eagle catching a salmon. Broken from his trance as the light dispersed, Sam grabbed the back of my shirt collar and pulled me away from the tent door, using his whole body weight to move me. I fell back in an exaggerated stagger to the rear of the tent as the shape of the bird began to fill the view of the door. With a sickening sound of tearing cloth, the entrance of the tent began to lift off the ground, with the giant claws of the Thunderbird piercing the roof. We felt like fish in a net as the bird's force plundered through the air and ripped the tent from the ground, the solid bottom of our enclosure becoming nothing and the stakes popping out of the wet ground. Our world shifted as we felt gravity sidestep us and put above where below should have been. We fell on top of each other in the side of the tent, which was now the bottom, as we became airborne. Feeling utterly powerless, we screamed in protest and fear, only to be met with more of the furious giant wing beats and content grunting of the Thunderbird. In less time than a blink, we were made a sack lunch for the avian giant. The air whizzed around us as we were carried off into the sky for what felt like hours, but surely was only seconds, while we squirmed around in the bottom of the sack. Rain pelting the side of the tent and soaking us to the bone as we finally managed to sit upright, the air becoming thinner and thinner with each wing beat as the creature sailed in new heights. The look in Sam's eyes was something I will never forget, the unmistakable look of defeat, sadness, and fear, and I'm sure that my face showed nothing better. Suddenly, our airborne tent was met with a crash to the side. We smacked against something in flight. Sam and I were tussled about in the moving sack as our rough flight was made even more rough. That same horrible screech was heard from the Thunderbird at a deafening volume. We both covered our ears to block out the harsh frequencies. Our tent rocked back and forth from the impact like a ship on a rolling ocean. From afar, we heard a similar screech that moved through the air as we did. Sam and I shared the same face as we exchanged glances of horror. The absent lightning made a stark return, with the bolts being much closer now. Looking at the wall of the tent like a shadow puppet show, we saw the illumination of another massive bird flying beside us. We gripped onto each other and to the walls of the tent as we braced for another impact. The second bird's shadow crept closer and closer with each strike of lightning. Argumentative clucking and chirping could be heard from both birds as they neared each other, turning into screeches and shrieks. With a swoop, the second bird turned in midair, exposing its claws and gripping the tent in an effort to steal the sack from our bird. Once again, we were thrown around in the bottom of the bag as the two birds fought for their prize. With a struggle, we could feel our plummet internally as the weight shifted from our stomachs to our throats like an elevator dropping down too quickly. We screamed in unison, joining the screams of the birds, but certainly not being heard over their cackles. The shadow of the ground becoming ever closer and the lightning growing farther with every second. Gripping onto whatever we could, we felt the tent bottom begin to graze the treetops. Starting with a light touch and then becoming harder slaps, we were dragged across the treetops with sickening cracks of splintering wood. The birds' fight was a spectacle as their enormous bodies writhed together in the air. We caught glimpses through the tent of each massive head pecking and huge beady eyes angrily pointing the hate at the other. With one final strike, our tent collided with the branch of a low-hanging tree and our party came to a grinding halt. The birds lost their grip on us as they continued to move in the air while the tent did not. We screamed again, this time in pain as the branches poked through the tent, ripping the cloth and tearing at our flesh while we fell uncontrolled down the levels of the tree. With a thud, the tent bottom on which we sat landed on the wet ground and tossed us into the mud. The raging movement suddenly stopping and our bodies regaining the feeling of gravity as we laid there. Sam laid a few feet from me and I reached out my hand to grab his. The lightning still sparkling above us, we turned on our backs with heavy breaths to see what had become of the two birds. Like knights in a joust, they soared through the sky, and with every contact, they clawed and speared one another with beak and talon. The lightning crashed furiously around them while they battled for the primal reign of the mountain range. Their forms began to blur together as my eyes became heavy. The pelting rain and wind tried to keep me awake, but my body was shutting down and my breaths became more shallow and weak. The Thunderbird's calls rattled in my head along with the raging rolls of thunder, but both became more faint as they flew farther into the night and as I drifted away.